Okay, so let's start with what is a university. And there's a very good definition of a university that our first Prime Minister, Pandit Nehru, provided. And this has very little to do with what courses universities should teach, but it has to do with what sort of people universities should produce. So he said that it stands for humanism, for tolerance, for reason, for progress, and for new ideas and the search for truth. So that's the fundamental reason of education, not just a university, but education. And Pandit Nehru also said that our universities have a vast responsibility, not universities and other education institutions, schools, because they are the ones who guide the destinies of people who go there. The first education minister, Maulana Azad, also said something similar, and he said that educationists, teachers should build the capacity of inquiry, the capacity of creativity, of making entrepreneurs, and very important, students who can provide moral leadership to their societies, moral leadership to the nation. So this is really what our forefathers imagined at the cusp of India's independence. More recently, Pankaj Chandra has written a very nice book, which is called Building Universities That Matter. Pankaj is currently the Vice Chancellor of Ahmedabad University, which, like Ashoka University, is a private university. But before that, he was director of IIM Bangalore. He taught at IIM Ahmedabad, very distinguished individual. And Pankaj says that universities are places of social development, places that inspire and provoke. Now, listen to each word of this: inspire and provoke, question and answer, build beliefs and destroy myths. They delve into the depths of the past and rise into the heights of the future. They debate the metaphysics of existence, yet create models to decode the mind. So according to Pankaj, the university, the education system is really a way of life. Now, you may think that public education is all about, public good. But public education is also about private enterprise. And the reason simply is that markets require innovation. And where would innovation come from? Innovation comes from educated individuals, people who have become experts in their own area of work. Governments, on the other hand, require citizens that have good social values. So universities provide, and schools, of course, provide this function. They teach people to think, to innovate, to solve problems, and to become better citizens. So it's very important. The role of schools and universities is not just to teach people, but to make them better individuals, people who can serve their family, people who can serve their society, their state, their nation. And of course, as you see, innovation is driven by research that is done in these places. So even private enterprise depends on that. But let us look at the growth of higher education, at least in the country. So in 2021, India had a gross enrollment ratio of 27%. What this essentially means that if there are 100 people who are eligible to go to a university, how many of them are in a university? So only about a quarter of the people who are eligible to go to a university are actually in a university. Now, if the dream of the political leadership is to increase the gross enrollment ratio by 50%, which is off to 250%, which is often read in the media, then we would have to increase capacity, double the capacity, increase the number of schools, colleges, and everything that goes around with it. If you look at 1950-51, India had 27 universities, and almost 600 colleges, and roughly 0.2 million students, 2 lakh students. 2019-2020, India has over 1,000 universities, about 40,000 colleges, and the number of students has increased roughly 75 times. So India has the third largest higher education system in the world, but unfortunately not a single institution in India is in the top 100 in the world. And you can see the problem from this slide itself, that in a matter of about 60 years, we had to increase capacity hugely. And when you increase capacity so quickly, quality suffers. And that is what has happened in India. Processes have suffered, quality has suffered, and universities and colleges have simply become places of employment and places where people go to get a degree. Whether they learn something or not is secondary. So let me switch to something called the quadrant model of scientific research. And this is, you'll see why I am presenting this. This comes from research. And this was based on a lecture that Professor Balram, who was the previous director of Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore, and a very critical thinker, gave several years ago. And Balram made this quadrant with 2 axes. One is fundamental research, and the other is use-inspired research, what we call basic research and applied research. So an example of high-quality fundamental research would be the discovery of the electron by Niels Bohr. When Bohr discovered electron, he was driven purely by curiosity. He had sort of no inkling whether there would be any commercial applications of this. On the other hand, when after several failed attempts, Thomas Alva Edison finally discovered the light bulb, this was purely applied work. He immediately put it to use, and it had very little fundamental basic information involved. Louis Pasteur, on the other hand, who was one of the people who put together the germ theory of disease, discovered how disease is caused by germs. But his work was also of much practical application, because Pasteur's work led to vaccination. Pasteur's work led to understanding of how milk is converted into yogurt, and so on and so forth. So in India, most of our institutions are there in the lower left quadrant, which means that we neither do very good fundamental research, nor do we do very much use-inspired or applied research. So that's the academic R&D, academic and industrial R&D in the country. And the challenge really is to go from the left bottom quadrant to the upper right quadrant. So how must one do that? How do we take our institutions there? So Balram took this and converted this into most institutions and ideal institutions. And now you see that the axes have shifted. So instead of use-inspired or fundamental research, it's financial resources and administrative flexibility. So the point that he's trying to convey is that if you want to improve your institutions, you need to just do two things. You need to provide them financial resources, and you need to provide them administrative flexibility. One alone is not going to help. You can pour as much money as you want into the system, but if you don't give people administrative flexibility, it won't happen. And you can give them as much flexibility, but if you don't give them money, they won't be able to do anything. And now the order in which this happens, whether money comes first or flexibility comes first, it doesn't matter. But both of them have to be there. Coming from a chemistry background, I had to put in an equation here, but I'll explain it, and it's very easy to understand. If you go from most institutions to ideal institutions, there will be an energy barrier. Everything requires energy. Everything requires input of ideas, input of energy. And this is like a chemical reaction, going from reactants to products. There is an energy barrier to cross, always. And the higher the energy barrier, the lower is the rate of transformation. So that's all this equation says, that if your energy barrier is very high, the rate at which change takes place is low. But if your energy barrier is low, and this is what enzymes do in biochemical reactions, they reduce the energy barrier of a reaction. And that's why enzymes are so good at converting reactants to products. So the same thing really applies here. But what really is this barrier height? Barrier height is the faculty that you hire in institutions. Barrier height is the administrative flexibility you give. And at the end of the day, it is the public and political will. Political will because politicians sanction money to institutions. Public will because public elects those politicians. So in a democracy, we can't get away and say, well, politicians are doing this, what can we do? You are in a democracy determining who is there to make the decisions. So think about that, but these are facts that will not change. All right, so what do you do to build world-class institutions, whether it's a university or a school or a research laboratory or an academy? What do you need? I keep saying this: you need autonomy, you need leadership, and you need funds. You can't do without any of these. You can pour as much autonomy and funds, but if you don't provide them the right leaders, they won't do very well. What is autonomy really? And I'll go back to what Pankaj says in his book, that autonomy is something that allows for simplification of rules. It creates local models that work for an institution. A school in Kashmir may have different problems than a school in Delhi. But if you're going to drive them by the same administrative stick, it's not going to work. It won't work either in Kashmir or in Delhi. So you must provide local models that work and build a community that makes its own choices. You can't have somebody sitting in Delhi telling you in Kashmir what you should be teaching or how you should be dealing with your students. Conditions are very different. And autonomy really enables well-prepared individuals and well-intentioned institutions to get better. So if you really look at it, our entire education system is based on standard input, which means that you have to qualify this exam or that exam, you have to learn this or that. It doesn't matter what the outcome is. And as a result, because of this standard input, the output is very variable. A small percentage of people excel, most of them don't really care, and a small percentage just flunk out of the system. But if you provide variable inputs, towards a standard output where you go ahead and take care of most of the people who are studying, then the situation is different. Autonomy also requires diversity. And by diversity, I don't just mean you should have enough women there, you should have enough minorities there. All that is important. But I think what is more important is diversity of ideas. In an education, in a good, well-rounded education, it is the diversity of ideas that are important. Instead of telling people facts and letting them, just learn facts and put them out in an exam. Of course, faculty hiring and assessments are very important, and this is where we pay very little attention. If you hire in a university, if you hire a bad professor, he or she doesn't do as much damage as hiring a bad assistant professor, because the system will not allow you to get rid of the assistant professor for the next 30 years. The professor will retire in the next 5-7 years. So think about that. And how do we do the hiring? Hiring is done by bringing experts from outside and letting them do the work that local people should be doing. An expert from outside does not know your academic culture, doesn't know your needs, and therefore will not be able to make the right decision that is needed for your institution. Unfortunately, since we don't have A, confidence in ourselves, and B, we are always worried about corruption, we bring people from outside. So as a result, you don't preserve your academic culture at all. Outsiders tell you who to hire and who not to hire. Leadership, of course, is very important, and I like this saying very much by Peter Drucker, that 3 things happen naturally in organizations: friction, confusion, and underperformance. Everything else requires leadership. And if you have good leaders, they take institutions to good heights. But if you have bad leaders, within a very short period of time, all the work gets destroyed. So leadership really is the significant aspect of organizational governance, because a good leader understands the evolving environment, and a good leader is not afraid of change. In fact, a good leader is one who talks to people to make them understand what change will do, and without sort of expressing his or her authority, is able to convince people based on ideas, based on intelligent arguments, rather than saying, well, I'm the vice chancellor, I'm the principal, and this is how it's going to be. So that's not a good leader. And finally, who is the leader accountable to? A leader should not be accountable to politicians. A leader should not be accountable to to the people who appoint the leader, but the leader should be accountable to the community that the leader is serving. So for example, in a university, is the executive council, which is the highest body. And who chairs the executive council? It's the vice chancellor. Well, that's completely wrong. How can you chair the body to which you are accountable to? So there are many flaws in our governance which have led to these sorts of problems. So what should future leaders do? And this is for you who are training future leaders. You should teach your students to think, and to think globally. Not just think what's happening in Srinagar or Jammu, but think globally. What are the ideas people are developing globally? They should be aware of that. And they should follow their intellectual curiosity. If somebody is interested in theoretical physics, there is no reason why that person should become, a bad engineer when that person can become a very good theoretical physicist. Or there's no reason why somebody should become a bad doctor instead of a good life scientist. So people have to follow their intellectual curiosity, and they must have cross-cultural appreciation and cultivate unfamiliar ideas. Change comes from unfamiliar ideas. If you only read things within your area of work, then you will not get any ideas from outside, and it is ideas from outside that really change any field. So people have to work in teams these days, and therefore it's also very important for people to get along with each other. People of different culture, no culture is good or no culture is bad. Every culture has unique things, and learn to appreciate every culture. The third thing is, of course, you have to be tech savvy. You can't get away without technology these days. But also pay attention to good writing. And I think this is one thing that our students have lost in the last maybe 2 generations. Uh, our students just don't write very well at all. Uh, I get a lot of emails with CVs in them, and the language is bad. Often in emails, WhatsApp language is written, full sentences are not written. That's no way to communicate. So people who get on with life, people who get ahead in life, are all very good communicators. They write well and they speak well. So this is something you must build in your students. Technology is one thing, but technology will not make you a better writer or a better speaker. That has to be, some people have to be trained for that. And finally, I think building alliances is very important, alliances and partnership, because all significant work these days is done in teams. Individuals, there are very rare occasions where individuals can make a huge impact. It is teams that make impact. So build alliances, build partnerships, and learn to work in teams. And finally, funds. So when we talk about funds, the fact is that a typical Indian university spends somewhere around 85 to 90% of its annual budget on salaries. There is really very little money available for any development work. And I can't imagine that schools would be any different from this. So there's very little money for development, there's very little money for research, and people have to depend on other sources for research. And if you look at this Government of India data, you will the orange line shows the increase in enrollment between 1980 to 2000, and the brown line shows you the increase in expenditure. And it's very clear that enrollment has increased much faster than expenditure, which means that progressively there is less and less money available in the system. And if you look at the table, as a percent of GDP, the amount allocated to higher education has actually gone down instead of going up. Although in absolute number, this number would have gone up simply because the GDP has gone up. But as a percent of GDP, the number has fallen, and that should be a matter of great concern. The same is true for research and development, and this is based on the report of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council in 2019, which itself said that the gross R&D spending has increased over the past decade. But if you calculate it as a percent of GDP, it has stayed in the 0.6 to 0.7% of GDP for 2 decades. All countries that have moved ahead have an average spend of about 2.5% of GDP. Countries like South Korea, Israel, they spend over 4% of their GDP on research and development. And in India, which aspires to be a knowledge economy, India, which aspires to provide innovation to the world, continues to fund research at 0.7% GDP for 20 years. That just cannot go on like this. And the reason simply is that the share of public expenditure is very high. Universities play a very minor role, and private investment into research is very low in a country like India. So compared to several advanced countries, government is the primary funder and user of R&D research. In the US education system, there are private universities, of course, that have huge endowments, but there are also state universities. And I studied at a state university in US. And people think that a state university is fully funded by the state. It is not. At best, the state legislature provides about 25% of funding for the university. 75% of the funds the university has to raise itself. And it does through endowments, it raises through innovation, through donations, all of that. So the PM's Advisory Council says that India's R&D is inadequate to meet its development goals. And one look at this graph and you will see India is right here. This is India's trajectory. This is the trajectory of countries we would like to compete with. And that immediately tells you that we have a problem. I'll briefly discuss two other questions that people ask. What should Indian scientists work on? And when will an Indian get a Nobel Prize? The second question is a favorite question of politicians and several other people. Well, what should Indian scientists work on? Indian scientists should work on good science. There is no basic science or applied science. There's only good science and bad science. And we should just work on good science. We should be working on curiosity-driven science where people are tackling important problems. And that's just not happening. As far as when an Indian will get the Nobel Prize, well, that's a wrong question to ask because, Nobel Prizes, according to Venki Ramakrishnan, who is a Nobel laureate, several years ago, he says that Nobel Prizes are a byproduct of good science. They are not the goal of good science. It's like wanting a Mount Everest without the Himalayan range. You can't have a Mount Everest unless you have the Himalayas. So important thing is to build those Himalayas. The Mount Everest will happen. You don't have to build a Mount Everest. So that's really key to what Indian scientists should work on. And Homi Bhabha, of course, who was the creator of several institutions like the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research, the Bhabha Atomic Research Center, father of India's nuclear program, he says that a scientific institution has to be grown with great care, like a tree. And he thinks that it takes just a few outstanding individuals to create first-rate institutions. And it takes at least 10 to 15 years for institutions to grow. Unfortunately, in India, when we create institutions, we pour so much money into institutions up front. But as time goes on, their funding disappears. So the average institution in India cannot remain competitive beyond 20 to 25 years. Whereas, 20 to 25 years is really your growth phase. You come to a critical point at that by then. So sustained support and of course all the other things, academic culture, all that is important. So finally, what should we teach our students? So I think we should teach our students about curiosity and opportunity. Uh, Curiosity is related to exploration, to investigation. So instead of teaching students facts from a textbook, it is always better for them to experience and come to that conclusion. And this can be done not just in sciences, but it can be done in social sciences as well. So a lot of exploration based teaching is required, where students learn to observe and they learn from observation, because it is exploration and observational learning that's going to lead to change. Teaching people facts from a textbook saying what king was born in what year and what year that king died is not going to make any difference to anyone. uh, and curiosity will lead to opportunity. And I'll give you one example of opportunity. All of you have gone through last 2 years of COVID, and you may think that COVID has been really bad. Of course it has been bad. It has killed so many people, it has infected so many people, there have been lockdowns. But although COVID was a challenge, it was also an opportunity. And I'll explain this picture in just a minute. During the last year, China eradicated malaria. All this happened during COVID. NASA flew a helicopter on Mars. The helicopter was taken to Mars, it was flown on Mars. Think about it. Renewable energy grew faster than ever. Brain-computer interface went through a lot of advancement, which means that you can draw things on a computer, you can write things on a computer just by thinking about it. And this picture is about that. It's from a man who is completely paralyzed and who got chips planted in his brain, and he drew a cat just by thinking about it. So think about the tremendous advancement where you can do things simply by thinking about them. Clean fusion energy developed last year was 700 times the US energy grid capacity. Physicists have proposed a fifth force. Electric cars have reached a tipping point, breaking all records with global sales. Artificial intelligence made huge progress. One of biology's fundamental problems of how a protein folds based on an amino acid sequence was solved by a computer program, by a computer called DeepMind, using a program called AlphaFold. And this is a fundamental challenge of biology that has been tackled. Advances in CRISPR technology now are available to cure genetic diseases. And all this, mind you, happened during the last year that we went through COVID. Quantum computing took huge leaps, breaking the 100 qubit barrier. The largest wind farm ever built was built offshore in the UK. And by next year, it will power 2.3 million homes with electricity. Space tourism, you know how people have gone as tourists in space, and of course the Webb telescope, which was launched just a few weeks back. Research in plastic recycling had a major breakthrough, which turned plastic waste into oil, into energy. So imagine what this can do to clean up the environment and to produce energy. And finally, coming back to COVID, COVID was a challenge, but it also provided a huge opportunity, because this is the first time a vaccine was developed within 10 months, 12 months of time. And this is the first time in human history that a pandemic is being controlled using a vaccine. It has never been done. So the point of listing all this is that you may think that 2021 was a really bad year, but was it really a bad year? There were challenges, but there were opportunities, and people took hold of these opportunities and moved forward. We often come around these terms, knowledge and wisdom. What is knowledge and what is wisdom? And you may be wondering what this tomato is doing on this slide. Well, knowledge is knowing that tomato is a fruit. But we all know it's a fruit, it's not a vegetable. But wisdom is not using tomato in fruit salad. Have you ever seen a fruit salad with tomato in it? So that's the difference between knowledge and wisdom. But with knowledge comes wisdom. If people have knowledge, they can think. They can think through problems without having to speak loudly or without having to fight. And these are people who make the world change. And finally, I think you should be teaching this to your students, that before they talk, they should think. The brain has to be connected to the tongue before they start talking. So I'm going to just stop there and take questions that you may have. I may not have all the answers, but I'll try to.